It's 3 minutes and 3 Central European time. So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Media Diversity Institute's conflict reporting with a special focus on reporting war in Ukraine online discussion. My name is Dasha Ilic. I will be moderating today. And of course, because tomorrow we will mark 1 full year since Russian troops invaded Ukraine, Media Diversity Institute, that some of you might know, has been founded and was born out of the conflict, out of the wars in former Yugoslavia, wanted to at least try to give some answers, or better say, pose some questions about the independent journalism, challenges and opportunities for journalists when they report on the war or from the conflict zones. I have 3 journalists today with me, prominent media professionals. I'm very honored to welcome Elena Kostyuchenko, a Russian investigative journalist working until recently for Novaya Gazeta. I shouldn't be explaining the oldest independent media in Russia, Novaya Gazeta, whose license, by the way, was revoked by the Russian court a couple of months after the war in Ukraine started. Elena, thank you very much for joining us today. We have rare opportunity to hear Russian journalists and their experience on reporting on the war in Ukraine. We also have Artyom Lis, experienced journalist, editor, and digital media strategist. Artyom, your biggest part of career, or great part of career, was dedicated to the BBC. You oversaw BBC Europe region, but also were supervising the work of BBC Russian, Ukrainian, Azerbaijani, Serbian service, etc. Now Artyom leads Flying Fox Media. Welcome, Artyom. And our third guest is Aidan White, founder and president of Ethical Journalism Network. Aidan also served as General Secretary of the International Federation of Journalists for 25 years, which means that Aidan supported many journalists in conflict and war zones. Also, he's the author of several articles dedicated to ethical dilemmas when it comes concerning media coverage of the Ukraine. Since we don't have much time, I'll start straight away, but I will also encourage our participants to ask questions. You have many options. You can pose your question in a chat box, but also I would encourage you to raise your hand, which means that we will disable your camera and microphone so that you can speak and we can see you. But I'd like to start with the challenges of reporting the war in Ukraine. Artyom, I'll start with you. Since you've been engaged in drafting many digital strategies, and many would say that this war is not led only on the front line, but also in a very noisy digital environment. We can see what disinformation, hate speech, rumors, gossips, and all that wrapped up in a propaganda on many occasions can do. So what is, in your opinion, the biggest challenge that journalists are facing when they report on the war in Ukraine? Or just unmute you. Can you unmute yourself? You're muted, Artyom.
There we go. Can people hear me now?
Yes, now
Fantastic.
we can.
Okay, so the first thing I would say is that it strikes me as a little bit of a generalization to say that journalists generally face more or less the same challenges, because I think if you think about the groups of journalists covering this war, the Russian journalists face a set of challenges which is entirely different from what their Ukrainian peers face, and then different again from the issues which foreign journalists have to deal with, and from the issues which regional or local journalists have to deal with. So I wouldn't generalize, and I wouldn't say that there is one like overall overarching challenge. But what I would say is this. I think the biggest issue with any war or with any coverage of any war is the issue of trust. we have seen that audiences are generally losing trust in the media, as indeed they're losing trust in generally in the elites. But that trend tends to change, and this trust tends to start growing when there is a crisis on our hands. We saw that very clearly during COVID. If you look at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism and their report into the digital news report, it very clearly shows that trust in the media had been dipping, then it went up again during COVID, and then it started dipping again. So I think Ukraine, or the war in Ukraine, actually had a very, very similar effect. When the war began, when we were all in crisis mode, consumption spiked and also trust spiked. But then as the war dragged on, this sort of crisis mentality that audiences face, that sort of crisis mentality tends to begin to peter out a little bit. And then with that, also trust begins to decline and audience begins to decline. So audiences sort of normalize to an extent. I know it's a horrible thing to say about a country that's at war, but to an extent, audiences begin to normalize the reality in which they live. And then the consumption of the media becomes kind of normalized with that as well. So in this environment where it's almost business as usual in terms of how people perceive journalists' work, it's important to think about what media can do to maintain that trust and to maintain that level of interest. So the biggest question in any digital newsroom, the biggest question always is there's a spike in interest when there's a big news event. That spike drops off. How do you maintain a new level that is higher than the level before? I think the bits which do not help are perhaps easier to list than the bits which do help. So I don't think that shifting into a campaigning mode helps necessarily, because the world is not black and white, and the media sort of sometimes feel like they have to pander to their audiences and they have to say to a celebrating audience or a concerned audience exactly what those audiences want to say. I think that is understandable, but potentially quite dangerous. And I was really heartened by what a Ukrainian journalist called Danilo Mokrik said on a recent call with Internews. So he runs an investigative outlet in Ukraine, which had been primarily focused on corruption, then shifted to covering the war crimes of the Russian army. And he said, and I'm now quoting, he said, we are now back reporting on corruption. We've come back to doing that in the summer. And here's the important bit. He says, we should not allow ourselves to fall prey to propaganda wherever it comes from. And he says, I don't think that reporting on corruption in Ukraine somehow damages Ukraine. And then also on that same call, there was a local journalist, or a local editor, I should say, Andriy Degtyarenko, who said that during the war, again, this is a quote, during the war, many journalists are not happy to talk about issues in government because they don't want to attack or to be seen to be attacking the local or broader government in wartime, and they do not want to provide ammunition to Russian propaganda. But this is not what our mission is as journalists. That's something Mr. Degtyarenko said. And I kind of thought, okay, so how do you, if this is the approach of Ukrainian journalists, which sort of see their role as not just merely waving the flag, then how do you sustain the ideals of journalism in wartime, especially in the middle of a potential Twitter storm where you say something and everybody starts shouting at you from the rooftops about just how bad you are, where everybody starts saying, that there are constant accusations of what in Ukraine, in the Ukrainian language, we call zrada or betrayal. And I think the first thing to do there is to slow down for a second and to think about what your media outlet is for. There's a very sort of clear benefit to having a clear mission to what you're doing and to making sure that your staff understand that that's what they're doing. So that there needs to be a very clear, a very deliberate sense of this is what we're here for. This is what a media outlet is for. This is who we are working for. And everybody needs to understand that very clearly. And then once that has been established, I think it really helps to be transparent about this is what we have decided, this is what we're doing, and this is why we're doing it. Transparency breeds trust like nothing else. And
I think I like that point about transparency and also trust, and also what you said, that world is not black and white. And I would add to that the voices that we are hearing are not unified. And that's what's happening, for instance, and I'm bringing Elena into this discussion, that sometimes, or some of us tends to think about Russian journalists as unified advocates of Putin regime, and you are the representative here of independent journalism in Russia. By the way, I want to hear your experience about how you reported and what is your experience of reporting from conflicts, or in this particular case on the war in Ukraine, and why you are not in Russia. Tell us about that if you want to share with other participants. Just unmute yourself, Elena, if you can, because we can't hear you.
Sorry, yeah.
Yes, only we can.
Well, I cannot go back to Russia because our legislation had been changed during the wartime, and now basically to tell any information which is controversial with the official information about this war is a crime, and it can be punished up to 15 years in prison. And though since the first day of the war I was reporting this war from Ukraine, I did crime. I'm a criminal according to Russian law, and when I come back home, I'm gonna be sent in jail. My newspaper is closed. We don't have media license anymore, and also our website is blocked, as many of websites of independent media in Russia. Actually, when you asked your question, I was quite surprised, and you said that from afar, it seems like all Russian journalists are unified and being supportive of the war. Like, my newspaper was existing for 29 years. We lost 6 journalists murdered for their work, and it's like a huge price we paid. As many other independent journalists in Russia, far before this war, far before Western countries put the attention finally at who Putin is, we tried to prevent actually what had happened. Yes, we failed, and yes, probably we should have worked more or be better journalists, be more effective, but we cannot deny our existence. About my experience, I was very lucky to enter Ukraine, though since like the war had started, people with Russian passport weren't allowed to come to Ukraine, obviously. But I got very lucky, and some Ukrainian officials helped me. And then I got enormous amount of help from usual Ukrainians, militaries, and not, who really deeply understood why I was here and what I was doing. We really wanted Russians to know what their country, like how their country is murdering Ukrainian people. And that's why I got so many help. Not just from officials, but from very usual people who provide me information and help. And sometimes even they let me to stay in their places because it wasn't easy to find a place to stay. And who were willing to speak with me and tell me what did they see, what did they experience, everything. The ethic issue I faced there, it's quite an obvious one. I was still a representative of Russian media outlet, though Russia is attacking their country. And though Novaya Gazeta is quite well known in Ukraine, and I didn't have too much trouble explaining who am I did have some trouble about it. And the worst thing I had issues with is the language, because basically I spoke Russian language, and though I worked in the territories of Ukraine, which it was historically Russian-speaking regions like Mykolaiv and Kherson and Odessa. During this war was going on, people start not they started rejecting Russian language. They started to speak Ukrainian instead, and we didn't like even to hear Russian language because for them it was the language of the aggressor. And I had like quite strange situation, though many of people I met didn't know English, and I cannot use English. And it was strange for me to find a translator, because like all of people I talked with, they are bilingual, so we don't need a translation, but we don't like to hear the Russian anymore. And I can totally understand it. So I'm learning Ukrainian right now. I hope it will help me to not to re-traumatize people who already traumatized so much. Yep. And I also need to tell about one aspect what people from afar, from the Western countries, probably don't really notice. So Putin didn't just close lots of independent media outlets, they also blocked their websites in the internet. So the only one, it also some of social medias blocked, like Facebook and Instagram and Twitter were blocked right now in Russia. You can't open it without VPN. And basically to access the independent information in Russia right now, you need to have VPN, but you cannot pay for the VPN because of sanctions. Because of sanctions, all Russian Visa, debit, credit cards are blocked. And I don't really understand how it will help to overcome Putin if my card doesn't work or my mom cannot pay for the VPN. But I know how it helps Putin because my mom cannot reach the true information which is collected by my colleagues. And yeah, it's not like I'm complaining. It's war. Things goes bad, it happens, but I don't really feel it was the goal of the sanctions. And I believe it would be great for, journalist organizations to advocate somehow on the political level, or I don't know, to approach IT people to find a solution for Russian people, because 147 million of Russians right now are totally cut from the true information, and it's simply dangerous.
It's a very good point, Elena. Thank you much. First of all, that it's such a, we hear in the West, and also not so many media report and give us these personal testimonies. Now we know, you told us a little bit of how it is for Russian independent journalists to go to Ukraine, and also a little bit of this aspect, what are you faced with? So thank you for that. Aidan, you, as I said, you were supporting many journalists in many conflict zones. And I know that you wanted to bring this debate to the level of what we also face when it comes to our core values, or our main postulates of our profession, that I have to say, after hearing Artyom and Elena, is actually a great profession to have. Just unmute yourself, Aidan, please. Yeah, your microphone.
Well, look, thanks very much, Dasha. I'm really inspired by what I've heard from Artyom and Elena. I think the points that they make are really relevant and really to the point. I mean, I mean, I think this is like all conflicts. This conflict has a lot of victims, and many of the victims are not just the profession of journalism, but actually journalists themselves. I mean, I think around 12 journalists have been killed so far in the war in Ukraine. And so that question of safety and risk of journalists is actually always paramount and should be in our minds. I think the points that have been made are absolutely right. You cannot generalize about how to report and how the reporting is done in this conflict. All conflicts are the same. There are different perspectives, and we really have to examine how we approach it. Now, in normal circumstances, I would say this: all journalists should support the 5 core values of journalism. And we know what they are: accuracy, fact-based communications, political independence, impartiality in the way that we work, humanity in our reporting, and respect for all sides of society, and, as Ertem says, transparency, through which creates accountability as well. So these are core values, are very straightforward, but sometimes these core values can't be put into practice. That's the reality. Voluntarily, we see sometimes there's a partial suspension of these values, particularly by media who are recognizing that the safety and welfare of their public and their people is threatened and are at stake. And there's a sort of a rise of protection of national interests. And that's a perfectly valid a position to be in. It means that in both Ukraine and Russia, it's not a surprise to see voluntarily some media supportive of their respective governments and armed forces, and giving priority to highlighting the plight of the people involved in the war from their side. Look, this shouldn't be surprising. Remember the United States media and its response immediately after the attacks in 9/11? The United States media virtually suspended the core principle of both sides of the story. It suddenly stopped telling the story of the Middle East from a Middle Eastern perspective. And that in a way was understandable because of those conditions. But such a suspension of professionalism, in which national interests take precedence over universal principles of journalism, has to be temporary. And above all, it should not lead to what's happened in Russia. That is legal persecution of journalists who absolutely refuse to voluntarily censor themselves. And it should never lead, even by media that are very supportive of governments, to reckless hate speech, malicious lies, demonization, and incitement to indiscriminate violence. I know it's easy to say this because, you know, one's actually looking at it from the outside. So this is the challenge for journalists in both Ukraine and Russia. Now, look, for journalists who are reporting as foreign correspondents, there's no partial suspension of values. Absolutely, there shouldn't be. And there are hundreds in Ukraine right now. And there's no excuse for any of them not to keep faith with the core values of journalism. There is a strong temptation to convert what is widespread public and political support for Ukraine into warmongering propaganda. And we see some of it in some of the Western coverage. But ethical journalists, absolutely, they need to know better than this. They need to tell the story really how it is. I mean, for example, I was impressed the BBC's coverage of what's happening in Russia. Recently, I saw they're very careful to say people in Russia may be heavily influenced by state media propaganda. That's true. State media wield enormous power. But as the BBC found out, if you dig deeper, you will find genuine support deeply embedded in some parts of Russian society and the wider population for this war and for the Russian position. So what journalists can best do always in a conflict is to explain things, go beyond the sound bites of propaganda, give more detailed context, avoid the slippery language of bias and propaganda. Because, you know, as we all know, the biggest challenges are yet to come. And Ertem highlighted, I think, something which is really very important, that question of corruption. The question of investigating and exposing corruption does not stop because the guns are firing. It's really important, and particularly in Ukraine at this moment, there are millions upon millions of foreign aid being transferred into Ukraine. There is an enormous amount of commitment for reconstruction, for protecting the people and so on. The question is, how is that public funding going to be spent? It's one journalist from Ukraine summed it up this week. For journalists, it's a task of historic proportions to investigate corruption that is almost certainly going to follow this enormous transfer of support. So the challenges for journalists are actually very clear and very strong, but we shouldn't be surprised if at this moment, some journalists, both in Ukraine and in Russia, are putting on hold some of the core values of journalism that we hold very dear.
And many challenges will come after. Hopefully this war will end very soon, like reporting on war crimes, preserving the evidence online, etc., etc. Artyom, you have a hand up as you wanted to intervene or continue this discussion. We also have many questions. Just post them into the chat box or raise your hand and I'll give you the floor. So Artyom, please just unmute yourself. Yeah, you're there. Okay.
Yeah, I didn't really want to intervene. I just wanted to pick up slightly on what Aidan said. I think the role of foreign media in a wartime environment is hugely important. And I think for a Russian journalist or a Ukrainian journalist in this context, or for Israeli journalists or Palestinian journalists in the Middle Eastern context, although I'm not trying to compare this war with the events in the Middle East, far from it, I think it is very, very difficult psychologically to step aside and to try and cover things in a sort of evenly and in an accurate and balanced manner, not because people are not trying to do a good job. I'm sure they are, but because if you start to dig into corruption in how Western support money is being divvied up, if you start to dig into issues like potential cases of bullying within Ukrainian army, which we have had and which are really inevitable in any army that's at war, then you suddenly become a focus for the Twitter storm of people saying that you're at one with the enemy. And it's very difficult for you to resist that. So even if you might have the best of intentions and if you might want to do the most ethical journalistic job you can, dealing with your home country, with the entirety of your home country, and this is what it may seem like on the internet, attacking you and calling you unpatriotic and all of those things, that's psychologically incredibly difficult. And this is where the foreign press can come in really handy and can be really, really helpful, because luckily a lot of the foreign journalists do not have the same pressure put on them. But for people within a country at war, accepting that a foreigner, in inverted commas, has the right to tell them about their own country is a very difficult thing to do. But I think if there was one thing which might help the understanding of what's going on within both Ukraine and in Russia, it's perhaps listening to those voices from the outside. It's not so much that I'm trying to argue or sort of pick holes in any arguments, but I just wanted to slightly build on what Aidan said.
That's a very interesting point. I wanted also to bring up the difference between the embedded journalists, as we see that many, and usually there are big international media sending journalists to follow the governmental officials or military officials reporting from the conflict zone. And then we have those local reporters or freelance reporters. And I think in Ukraine, the access was allowed to some of the big media and foreign reporters, not to the local one, due to some rumors whether they have access to good connections or to the money they can pay. I don't know, but there is a difference, and we need to bring the point of whether the embedded journalists and journalism actually is harmful and how it changes our perspective and how it defines the public opinion and what actually we can do as media professionals, ethical journalists to help independent journalists, both in Ukraine and Russia. Elena, I'm bringing you or Aidan up, and then I'll have the audience asking questions because I can see they're eager to discuss it further.
Well, I mean, I think that the perils of embedded journalism we know very well. It's very difficult to be embedded and to be journalistically independent. At worst, we have seen some examples where some journalists who have been embedded with armed forces become active participants in the support of acts of war themselves. That's the worst part of it. But very often, being embedded is the only way in which journalists can get access to front lines or to near where the actual action is going on. But very often they are under control. They are very, very difficult for them to report freely and so on. So although it gives them access, it is access which is at a price and at a premium. And I think we have to be very, very careful. And we always ought to have more health warnings on public broadcasting, health warnings about the potential of embedded journalists. We need to make sure the readers and viewers know when people are embedded, when they're relying on a particular set of armed forces and so on. The really important thing I want to sort of build on is that foreign media reporting from Ukraine have an enormously important role to play in ensuring that not only do we hear from the vulnerable, the survivors and the victims, and the need for humanity in the way that this war is waged, not only do we need to hear that and hear these stories, we need to actually hear from them how media can contribute to creating at some point a space for dialogue, a space for a time when the guns will fall silent. What is required to do that? Media have an important role to play in trying to outline the parameters and the perspectives that will lead to the potential for peace and reconciliation. It's a long, long way away, but it's absolutely essential. And that's an essential role that media have to play at some point.
To the contrast of embedded journalists, we have Elena here, independent journalist, who just gave us such a personal take on and described so colorfully and so powerfully how it is to report from Ukraine for a Russian journalist. But also you gave some points about the audience, about the citizens in Russia. And I, as they would say, I feel you, because I used to be an independent journalist under sanctions. And then the question for you, what I want to hear from you is, do you see the way for reporters like yourself, way forward? Or let me rephrase, what do you think that would be better support or greater support for the reporters, independent journalists like yourself? How we can, and what we should do to support professionals both in Ukraine and Russia?
Well, I believe journalists in Ukraine and journalists in Russia are in very different positions, and like I cannot compare like difficulties I have with difficulties with like Ukrainian reporters doing their job literally under fire right now. Like it's incomparable. Okay, and I also want to make clear that me and my colleagues, we got lots and lots of support from different different organizations, like Reporters Without Borders helped me personally, for example, and it was a huge help from them. They helped with my medical issues and with my PTSD, what I faced after my experience in Ukraine. What is the most essential question right now? I'm gonna repeat myself. It's to bring help us get our readers back. So Putin was the one who cut this connection, and somehow sanctions helped him a bit, which is a bad thing. What we basically need, we need a simple and simple and affordable solution for people in Russia to access the independent information if we cannot pay for VPN, or if VPN is not working, because right now Russian government tries to block VPN as well. It's vital, because without it, we lose sense of reality. More people go to war, and kill Ukrainian people. And yeah, I mean, it's insane. It will never stop without people understanding what's happening. And we are very ready to continue our work. Though my newspaper is closed, some of my colleagues reopened Novaya Gazeta in Europe, and they keep working. Me personally, I joined Medusa, another large independent media, who already have VPN included in the application, so we can avoid this, Russian restrictive measures, so we still can access our readers. And we all are very motivated. Most of us, we lost our country, our homeland. It is painful. We want it back. We have families there. We have our loved ones there. So we're gonna fight for them, and we're gonna fight for our readers, and we will never stop. So some technical solutions would be great, and possibly also put attention on Russian investigations about corruptions of Russian government and Western politicians who has like long established relationship with Russian politicians, and all this money laundering and all this way how Russian oligarchs and politicians avoiding the sanctions, and they're hiding their money in the other countries. I mean, we regularly publish this stuff, so please pay attention. It would be really great if you will.
Thank you, Elena, especially with giving such a practical and concrete advice on what to do. Artyom, I have your hands up, and then I will bring Milica Pešić, who I can see in the chat box has already a question for our panelists. So please go ahead, Artyom.
It's just a quick observation that it's, I agree with Elena, it's vital to get the audiences back, but it's also absolutely vital to get the funding back and to think about how the media outlets which have lost their access to funding, either because they are banned, as is the case in Russia, or because they have been pronounced extremist, which is the case in Belarus, or because the economy is in a dire state because of the war, as is the case of Ukraine. So how can those media organizations continue to be supported financially? I know that a lot of people in the media development community tend to sort of be very concerned about giving what they see as grants for core funding. They want to say, well, we're actually going to help you with funding, but we're only going to do that if you launch a new TikTok channel, or if you, I don't know, build a new content management system. That's all absolutely great in peacetime. In wartime, I think it's really important that core funding for media organizations, which through no fault of their own are unable to make their own money, continues to exist in some shape or form.
Thank you, Artyom. Milica is here with us. Milica, Executive Director and founder of Media Diversity Institute, also with a great experience of reporting from the war. Milica, you have a question, so please go ahead.
Well, I wanted to ask a question. Then when I heard Artyom, what he just said, Artyom, I totally agree with you. And let's complain a bit about the funders, because it's really important. Don't push us into what's fashionable, what's trend now in media development, TikTok or whatever. Give a chance to those who are really on the ground and know what they need. And my question is basically, usually, and that's my experience from our Balkan wars, but also, you know, when monitoring what was happening in Rwanda, usually ethnic and religious tropes come as quote unquote useful tools to dehumanize the others. Is this the case of the media in this war? Is there a difference between local, national, and foreign media when we talk about how you refer to the others? And I assume there is a difference between propagandist and independent media. So all three of you are more than welcome to answer, but particularly Elena and Artyom.
Well, propaganda definitely does that all the time. Like if you turn on Russian TV, you can hear all the shit about like Ukrainian Nazis killing the kids. Like it's happening all the time. From independent Russian media, I saw the opposite tendency, not to criticize Ukraine or Ukrainians, because right now we are under attack of Russian army, so it would be unethical, as people say, to write not bad things, but like things which are not things which can make the whole picture more difficult to understand. And I faced it myself, like when I published my first report from the war. There was one woman who was trying to reach the border to flee the war, and she had to walk for like 17 kilometers by her feet, and she was too old and too tired to do it by herself. And she found some like volunteers who was basically doing like, you know, traffic regulation, and she approached them and started to scream at them something like, yeah, let's Putin let's Putin occupy the Ukraine as soon as possible. If local authorities can't even provide buses to the border, and I published it, obviously, and I think it's like super obvious because like she's very tired, she's exhausted, she's like frightened, and she's hysterical a bit. So let it be. I'm not the one who's gonna censor her. And when I faced that some of my readers and also some of people who I planned to meet were like, oh my gosh, you published here, you shouldn't have to do that, so because this way you support Putin invading the Ukraine. And I'm like, oh my gosh, guys, what are you talking about? Like, this is Ukrainian woman expressing her emotions. And though I can see that there is a tendency, but it's not only about this war. All the wars are the same in that matter, in my experience, that there is common narrative that like war itself is such a disgusting and senselessness thing. You cannot have any sense there, like people killing people. Though people want journalists who sent to the war and they see the war, they experience the war, they want to build some kind of narrative explaining what we see. And it's okay, it's what we usually do, but the war cannot be explained in some general narrative. And but people trying to do so, and we're falling into this into this wish when they want to make some of people heroes and some of people's villains, and we don't really report what's actually happening. I mean, we do report what's actually happening, but they censor themselves. They say, we will report this one because it will touch the heart of our readers, but we won't report this one because they can be offended by this, for example, right? And this is a very bad tendency. Actually, this is one of the reasons why wars are still happening, because people don't know how war looks like. We don't know. We simply don't know. We read the books, we see movies, we read reports from the war, and we see some clear, tragic, but in somehow beautiful picture of, I don't know, people struggling for their freedom, or people fighting Ukrainian Nazis. I mean, so self-censorship is the most dangerous kind of censorship on every war, by my own experience. Probably you will disagree.
There's so many aspects that you brought. I caught on this senseless war being senseless thing, and what I find interesting, but also could be dangerous, is that some people trying to find sense lead or tend to accept some of the conspiracy theories, or, as Milica mentioned, very old tropes and stereotypes, usually against others, usually against vulnerable, and then we just propagate and perpetuate the problem that we have. Artyom and Aidan, because we have 15 minutes left.
Can I just add? Look, the Melita's absolutely right. There are familiar tropes which are emerging and so on. I have to say that regrettably, we see in a lot of Western media coverage the growth of Russophobia. Anything that is associated with Russia, its culture, its history, anyone who has had a connection with Russia is tainted by the awfulness of this situation, and that really is terrible. So we need to sort of find ways of going beyond that sort of identification of an enemy or a group to demonize. And I think it's very dangerous when we go down that path. I think the need for journalism to focus on minorities, the people who are vulnerable, the people who are most at risk, the people who are being exploited, the people who are really the victims, and also not just to report on them as victims, but to give them a certain amount of power and empowerment and agency, and allowing their voices to be heard is absolutely essential. And I feel that very much about the dissident journalists in Russia, who are the independent journalists, the ones who are fighting for real values, democratic values, and for journalism, the high standards of journalism, and so on. They need more support, and I think they need to be given more recognition in the international media. I want to see more articles from Russian correspondents writing about the realities of how they're seeing it and how they're dealing with it in the Western press, and I feel one doesn't have enough of a sense of that resistance, of the courage that is being shown by many people in Russia in the current conditions. So I think there's a lot to be done in this area.
Milica, I can see your hand up. Please go ahead.
I just wanted Aidan to ask you, there is this question always, there is an aggressor and there is a side which is, defending itself. Do we need to have more understanding for reporters in Ukraine?
Look, I mean, I think there's absolutely no question about the struggle that Putin has to try to convince the world, not to say his own people, that actually they are not the aggressors, that Russia is not the aggressors. There's no question at all that there is a sort of universal consensus that what has happened here is unacceptable to all sorts of at all sorts of international levels. I think the United Nations is about to endorse a resolution which is critical of the action that's been taken by Russia, and the pressure will grow on Russia to return to pre-2014 borders in order to have a restoration of sovereignty for Ukraine. And that it clearly is emerging as a universal consensus. In that situation, it's quite clear. What media have to do is to explain and explain again and put in context how this war is being fought and why these issues are important and why they need to be understood better. So yes, I mean, I think there is a difference between our understanding of the struggle as it's being fought in Ukraine by Ukrainians and the struggle that's being fought in Russia. These are two quite distinct struggles, and they shouldn't be sort of mixed up as one. And media have a responsibility to create clarity in understanding the situation in Ukraine from a Ukraine perspective and the situation in Russia from a diverse perspective from within the society.
Can I add?
Yes,
can
please,
I add
please do.
very fast? What tendency, what I really like, I know, like, it's what in Russia we say, bad thing brought the good thing. So finally, there are so many new, brilliant, bright Ukrainian authors in the international media. And some of international media opened the offices in Kiev, and they hired local journalists. And it was what I was expecting for like years, because Ukrainian journalists are so brilliant. The professional level is so high. And though there was ongoing relationship between, like, for example, foreign editorial offices and journalists in Russia, there were no such relationships established with Ukrainian journalists, and now we are established, and I'm really happy about it. I mean, it's very I know that there is like this parachute journalism, then you send somebody from very afar into the field, and it has its good things, and we already discussed these things. But it's also very important to give the voice to the people who live on their land, who know their reality, and who can speak for themselves. And right now it's finally happening for the Ukraine, and I'm very happy about it.
Thank you, Elena. I have an interesting question that, in a way, it's in a similar context. We have this discussion. Alison Singer said that from anthropological perspective, arts, dance, music, and other forms can be used to promote nationalism, but also media can be used to give voice to ordinary people, to these personal stories, and to empower them, giving the opportunity to different voices to be heard. So Alison's question is how journalism can help promote this in the context of the war. Artyom, I haven't heard you for a while, so maybe you can answer this question.
I'm just looking at Alison's message again, and I'm sorry, that's why I'm not looking at the camera. So I think all good journalism basically does exactly that. It gives people an opportunity to be heard and to be seen. And that kind of slightly goes back to what we were saying earlier about how things like being embedded with the armed forces or being the first to cover a breaking story are maybe a little bit less of an issue now that, you know, in the era of the internet rather than television. I think the Ukrainian journalists certainly, and I'm sorry, Elian, I think to a slightly lesser extent, the Russian journalists have absolutely mastered the technique of character-driven journalism and of writing through the eyes of a person. So I think giving the voice to ordinary people caught up in a conflict is absolutely what people do. Now, the question then becomes, who are those ordinary people and who defines what is ordinary, what is extraordinary, and who gets a bigger voice, who gets a smaller voice. And unfortunately, again, there is no recipe for that. You can try all you like to be balanced and to cover both sides and do all of those things. But then some voices will necessarily be louder than others, as Yelena has just described. And I think that's where your skill as a journalist comes in, to be aware that she who shouts the loudest is not necessarily she who is the most representative.
And then we come to the question of all questions: can we as journalists be ever objective? Since we are coming to almost an end of this discussion, I would ask all three guests of mine to give final saying on this debate that I really enjoyed. And also, if there is anyone from the audience, please use the chat box and I shall read your comments or questions.
I think if you guys don't mind, I'll start. I think it's been a really interesting debate in terms of looking at the issues and thinking about what they mean for big things like the future of journalism and the future of our profession and the future of our countries. This is all fascinating stuff. But I think what we sometimes don't necessarily have enough time for is thinking about, okay, so we've discussed the issues. What are we going to actually do about it? What are actually the next steps? What are the practical things which we can take out of it? And I think if I were to sum up my thoughts, it would be just three things, really. Understand your audience, be transparent with it, be honest with it, and have a sense of mission, which all of your newsroom shares, and act on that sense of mission. And also self-check regularly. Are you doing what you think you're doing, or are you doing something completely different? And this self-check or this sense check is sometimes even better done by people who are external to your organization, perhaps by external evaluators or by industry bodies. But yeah, just sit back, think about what you're trying to achieve, think about who your audience are, what you're trying to say to them, and then be transparent with your own colleagues and with the audience about what you're doing and why.
Thank you,
And I would say, look, the message I get from this, and having heard Eleanor and Ayrton, I think journalists know what they should be doing. They know how to do the right thing, but actually most of them don't have the freedom to do the right thing. So I think what we have to do is we have to support independent journalism. We have to support those who are prepared to stick by core values, prepared to try to do the right thing. And particularly in Russia, I think the need for supporting independent journalism there is absolutely critical. There are so many good things being done by Russian journalists who are independent. Russians themselves are promoting, for example, I know through the Fetisov Journalism Awards, one of the world's leading journalism prizes being supported by Russians. And really, it seems to me that we need to reinforce the quality of independent journalism, of course, in Ukraine, but also mainly at this moment in Russia, where they are feeling the hard arm of the state against them.
I'm just very thankful for this talk and for discussing such difficult things like ethics and work on the war and all the complicity of the situation. I mean, the most important thing for me in this year was that though in the darkest moment, I never felt alone, though my newspaper doesn't exist anymore as many other independent media outlets in Russia, and though my country is clearly the fascist one and it's like keep killing people in Ukraine for who knows what reasons, though this professional support is so important, and I wish we could, have more conversation like today's one. I do believe it is important because when you are alone and fighting with all the government restrictions and you also like being in some kind traumatized of what's happening, and you cannot go back home, and in some or you can't approach your readers the usual way you did, and somehow you feel you lost. but you actually never lost. You always have colleague to ask their advice, to talk with them. And I'm very, very thankful for our talk today. Thank you.
I am also very thankful for this discussion that was organized by Media Diversity Institute to mark tomorrow 1 full day since the war in Ukraine started, and we also hope that will be the last anniversary. So that's why we focused on reporting the conflict, reporting the war in Ukraine. I also want to end this discussion with my great panelists and speakers and great audience today with some of the comments that I've read, how journalists, independent journalists from both Russia and Ukraine, maybe to collaborate and work together on some of the topics that will arise after the conflict, after the war has ended. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for the great discussion. And as I said, hopefully tomorrow will be the last anniversary that will mark. Goodbye.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you. All right. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.